Welcome to the History Nerd Podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today we got author Russell Shorto, Taking Manhattan. Listen, Island at the Center of the World, previous book from Shorto, it's freaking fantastic. Came out a bunch of years ago, and this is basically almost a sequel to it. And it is just as good as its predecessor. I was so excited to talk to Russell, had a great time, super intelligent guy who has a lot to say about this topic. So how about I just shut up? Let's talk to Russell. And here we are with author Russell Shorto, Taking Manhattan, the extraordinary events that created New York and shaped America. Russell, thank you so much for coming on.
Hey, Brendan. Happy to be with you.
Now, what made you decide to return to this time period? I don't want to call it a sequel. I feel like that kind of cheapens it. But Island at the Center of the World, one of my favorite books, definitely the best book on New York before it was really New York. What made you kind of decide to come back to this time period?
Well, Island at the Center of the World was based on the translation effort done mostly by Charles Gehring at the New York State Library in Albany, translating 12,000 pages of the official records of the Dutch colony. That was still ongoing, and it has been going on since the 1970s. And in recent years, they've now produced translations of the last few years in the life of the colony. And looking at that material, I came to see the colony and particularly the city of New Amsterdam, as this very robust, it looked like a sort of like a Wild West town, but with Dutch trappings, with gables and windmills. But it was connected to the Caribbean, South America, Europe. And so all this energy, I realized this is what it must have looked like to the English when they were thinking about trying to take it over. So I thought, what if I zoomed in on that moment, which everybody, including me, just kind of glides by. They think, oh yeah, the English took over, like it's as if it's inevitable, as if anything in history is inevitable. What if I zoom in on that moment? What would that story be? It would be this 2-week period in the late summer of 1664. The English are in their ships in the harbor, pointing their cannons at the fort. The Dutch are in the fort, pointing their cannons back at the English. So that's kind of the setup.
And I think you say it perfectly in the book, too. It's that story that everybody knows, but nobody really knows. When we're talking about this time period, what does Manhattan actually look like? I think that's something that people can't wrap their head around, even growing up outside the city. Like, just Manhattan is Manhattan. It's these big buildings. When we're talking about somebody rolling in there to take it over, what does Manhattan actually look like around that time?
Well, the city of New Amsterdam, as I just said, had this little Wild West village kind of look, and it was at the southern tip of the island. That was what's now the financial district. The rest of the island, very varied, many different ecosystems, stands of forest, swampland, the schist, of course, the rock that makes up or that sort of undergirds much of Manhattan, rimmed with reed beds, very rich in wildlife offshore, oysters and otters and porpoises, and the native people hunted seasonally on the island, deer, bear, wolves. There were all kinds of, animals, stands of beech and chestnut. And, the island was very, of course, it's been smoothed out. Its contours have been smoothed out by landfill and things. But it was just riddled with little coves and inlets and streams. And it was very kind of twisty and wriggly looking.
I mean, nowadays we would say it would have looked like something like a quaint seaside village.
Yeah.
With, people and just going about their day. And then something else you bring up, and really in both books, is we'll talk about New Amsterdam and we think Manhattan Island, that part of it too. But you also had a lot of stuff north of there. And those two connections and those two areas had to have sort of communication. It makes it a little bit more complicated than just saying necessarily Manhattan.
Sure. Well, Manhattan, in terms of settlements, was New Amsterdam, and then pretty far to the north was New Harlem, which became Harlem. And then also in that what's now the New York City region, you had the Dutch towns on Long Island, Vlissingen, which became Flushing, Vlakkenbos, which became Flatbush, of course, Brooklyn, that became Brooklyn. And then you had this one town within the Dutch colony on Long Island, Gravesend, which had been founded by the English. That comes to play a crucial role in this standoff between the English and the Dutch because the English ships, when they come in, they know that. And that's where they they anchor there in Gravesend Bay in order to, begin this kind of back and forth with Peter Stuyvesant in the fort.
And you just mentioned him. He was my next question. Whenever you're talking about this time period, Stuyvesant is the guy. What was he like? Is he somebody you would have liked to have had a beer with around this time?
Around this time, I think he would have been very on edge. Stuyvesant, a really, really interesting historical figure, and my understanding of him has become considerably more nuanced since I wrote Island at the Center of the World. When he arrives in New Amsterdam in the late 1640s, the place is in turmoil. There had been the previous director, Willem Kieft, had declared war on the native people in the region. And there had been this huge retaliation and people's homes were burned and they had to retreat into the fort. There's all this uproar and Stuyvesant is brought into the midst of turmoil. And he has this kind of hardline, no nonsense streak. And so he just immediately reacts by I'm the boss kind of thing, which doesn't get him very far with these very strong-willed traders who make up the population. He was there for 17 years. And over time, he learns to appreciate that just, carrying a big stick isn't going to get him where he wants to go. And he realizes that he's an employee of the Dutch West India Company. The directors are in Europe, and he's getting their letters, and he's got to deal with them. But on the ground are all these traders. And he comes to realize that if this place is going to succeed, they have to succeed. So he redefines his job almost to be a middleman between the West India Company, and the directors really don't get what's going on, and none of them have ever been to America, nor will they ever come, and the population. And when he starts to do that, he starts to become a really interesting figure. Meanwhile, this whole time, he and others have been fearing that the English eventually are going to come in, because while this is going on, while the Dutch colony in its 40 years is growing and going through all of its permutations, the English colonies in New England are growing, and there's English settlements to the south in Maryland and Virginia. And then you have English settlers as they grow in New England sailing across Long Island Sound from Connecticut to eastern Long Island and then moving west toward New Amsterdam and the Dutch cities that way. So they're slowly feeling like the English are coming for them.
Now, with Stuyvesant, you just said that, your opinion changed of him just a bit the more you learn about him. There's a lot of rough edges with him, especially when you look back in history. I sometimes wonder, could anybody else have done the job that he did? Did he, in a way, have to be the type of person that he was? Or do you think he started to figure it out more towards the end and maybe found a sweet spot, should we say?
Yeah, I think that the latter is the case. I think after the first few years, he started to figure it out and started to work with other people in the town and in the colony. And you had mentioned, as you had alluded to before, I didn't get to it, but the colony was much bigger. It went all the way. The second city was Beverwijk, which became Albany. That's 150 miles up the Hudson River. And the colony encompassed, parts of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Delaware. It sprawled, and he's working with these other people in the area and in his population to make it into, the Dutch at the same time had pioneered and invented some of the building blocks of capitalism. And they are using novel means of financing ventures, and everybody at different points, some of the people in town remark, everybody here is a trader. Everybody has a piece of a voyage that's going to the Caribbean for salt or whatever. So they together create this really novel kind of outpost.
Now, as far as other people, right? Because you can talk about Stuyvesant, we'll talk about Great Britain in a second, England doing England things. Someone I found really fascinating that you kind of pulled out of, nobody, never seen this name before, Dorothy Angola. Who is she? How did she figure into the story, and where did you first learn about her?
I really came to appreciate in looking at this standoff between the English and the Dutch, that it wasn't just the two leaders who were calling the shots. And in Stuyvesant's case, basically the whole of New Amsterdam, it's 1,500 or so residents. As these English ships are there, pointing their guns at them, they're all making their voices felt. It's really kind of democracy in action. So what I do in the book is I chose several individuals to we come check in on them periodically and give their backstory. Dorothy Angola was an African who came, I think she was probably part of the first group of Africans to arrive enslaved in 1627. So early on, just after the town is formed. And she marries another African. In 1644, a group of them petition for their freedom, which speaks to this kind of fluid understanding of what slavery was in the Dutch period. I think in part they were looking at indentured servitude as a model in which you worked for a certain number of years and then your service was done. So there wasn't a set term in this case, but after a number of years, they said, we think we've worked enough, and the West India Company grants their freedom for these men who applied and their wives. So now she's freed. They're given land. Her husband dies. She remarries. She's given land a couple miles north of New Amsterdam. And, plotting it on the grid today, it's like, okay, the 6 acres she had was Sullivan Street, Thompson, Bleecker, McDougall. So she had the West Village, Greenwich Village. And when I was watching A Complete Unknown, the Bob Dylan movie, it's like, these folk singers like Joan Baez in Greenwich Village in the 1960s, like singing about freedom and justice. And in the 1660s, there's Dorothea kind of living it, living this precarious freedom. And it was, even if they were given freedom, it was very precarious.
Now, there's a lot of stuff going on. Traders are being traders. They're doing what they're doing. All of a sudden, what makes England, well, to use a verb, England all over it? Why does all of a sudden England decides, hey, you know what? That should be ours. Let's get something going. Where does this idea come from?
So far, we're talking about the Dutch side, and this book, Taking Manhattan, probably 60-40 or 70-30 is an English story. And for me, that was kind of a revelation, looking at it from the English perspective on what was going on. And broadly, what was going on was, over the course of the 17th century, England becoming this bitterly divided society, highly polarized, to use a contemporary term, with the Puritans on the rise. And the Puritans are essentially religious extremists. And then in the English Civil War, when it comes out to war, the other side is normally thought of as the Royalists, which sounds like they're, carrying their banners in support of the king. And I guess a lot of them were, but I think it's more instructive to think of them as everybody who wasn't Puritan, everybody who didn't want this theocratic rule and, outlawing of singing and dancing and Christmas and all that. That split occurs. And in 1649, it comes to a head, literally, when King Charles is beheaded by the Puritans, and the Puritan leader, Oliver Cromwell, steps in, and you begin the Puritan rule. While that's going on, what I focused on in the book is Richard Nichols as sort of the central figure. He leads this flotilla of warships to come into the harbor, and he has this deep connection with the Stuart princes. So after the king is beheaded, his 2 sons go into exile on the continent, and Richard Nichols has known them his whole life. They've grown up together. He goes with them. He fights in England and then in France with them. Then in 1660, Cromwell has died, and the 2 sons come back. And the one, King Charles becomes king, and his brother James, the Duke of York, together they are going to kind of run the government now. And right off the bat, within months of taking power, England throughout this period is envious of the Dutch. The Dutch have their trading companies, and they're just going gangbusters, and the rest of Europe just can't figure it out. So they want to play catch up. They found right away Council for Foreign Plantations, which is to begin colonizing other parts of the world. The Royal Africa Company, which you can guess what its business ultimately is going to be. And the Royal Society, which is interesting because it's the Royal Society for the Advancement of Science, and it's still a highly prominent scientific organization. So they're doing all this stuff, and they're looking across the Atlantic, and they want to begin to build an empire. And they're looking at America, and they see that there are English colonies to the north and English colonies to the south, but right in the middle is this Dutch territory of New Netherland, and they decide they have to do something about this. So they have to look around for someone to lead an expedition, and they pick this guy, Richard Nichols, who they've known all their lives.
At this point, is New Netherland seen as kind of a jewel that it would become when it becomes New York and trading? Are they looking at that time and saying, like, this is a huge deal, this is something that we have to take? Or was it more of, this is just an obvious next step because, like you said, we have the colonies above and below, we might as well complete the set?
Yeah.
Or did they look at it and say, this is an extremely important place that we need to own?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think James, the Duke of York, whose project this was, and his advisors basically wanted to organize the American colonies. But once he appoints Richard Nichols to do this, Nichols starts doing his homework in London. He starts to interview people who had lived in the Dutch colony, and in some cases, people who had worked for Stuyvesant in his government. And he starts to form this picture of what it is. And this gets back to my talking about when these volumes of translations of the later years become available and I'm pouring through them, that I'm starting to see what Nichols saw as he was interviewing these people about what was going on, that, Manhattan, New Amsterdam, the island of Manhattan wasn't just a piece of real estate. What they were doing, what the Dutch were up to, was something really intriguing. In one respect, it's a manifestation of what they were doing all over the world, but there's a really unique thing going on, thanks to what we were talking about a few minutes ago with Stuyvesant working with these traders and all that. I think when he's still in London, he starts to formulate this idea that, I don't just want to bomb the place to smithereens.
Now, you talked about Nichols, right? He's fighting in wars. He's staying very close to the crown. When he gets on his ships to make his way over, what's his plan in his head? Is he thinking, I'm going to have to fight this thing out? Is he preparing for the worst? What is he thinking is going to happen when he actually gets there?
Yeah, he's given 4 warships and 450 soldiers, which is a lot for that time. And they are packed to the gills. I found the register of requisitions, which he had to, give a slip and then get that signed and then give it to the next guy. And, they're packed to the gills with all manner of weapons and gunpowder. And he's given very broad instructions because everybody knows, of course, in that day and age, you can't phone home and say, okay, here's what I'm dealing with, So again, this points to him being someone that they trusted to make decisions on the ground. But the understanding, based on all of that, the logical understanding was that what he would have to do probably is go and just level the place. And, the Dutch and the English were bitter rivals who fought a series of trade wars throughout the century. So this was not novel in that regard.
Now, when Nichols shows up, how much time does Stuyvesant have warning that Nichols is going to be showing up right around that time?
Stuyvesant made a couple of tactical errors. One, there was a native woman who was a chieftain who tried to warn him that her people had heard, because the English ship sailed to Boston first, and then they came down the coast. But he chose not to heed that. Also, when there was a report of English ships on the way, his directors in Amsterdam told him that they were leaving, but they said to him, don't worry, they are going to New England to install bishops. The Church of England is going to impose itself on the Puritans in this way. Stuyvesant has to decide, do I believe that or not? Or, how good is their information? He had this problem up north with the Mohawk around Beverwijk. And so he has to decide, do I go and deal with that? Or do I stay here in Manhattan and wait to see if the English are going to show up? Or maybe, for all I know, maybe they're just going to Boston. So he makes a decision that he'll go up north. And then as soon as he gets there, like the next day, they must have sent a messenger right after him. And the next day, the messenger shows up, probably, all sweaty and everything, and says, you got to come back. So he turns around and goes back, and he comes and finds, okay, they're in the harbor, they're off of Sandy Hook. And, this is all beginning. This drama is beginning.
I'd be remiss if I didn't point out, so wait, he was on the side of the Stuarts, fought a war against Pilgrims. Oh, he probably, when Nichols got to Boston, they probably weren't happy to see him at all.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think I made the point that when the Stuart brothers, the king and the prince, give him this assignment, it's a 2-part assignment. The first part is to deal with the Dutch and get this colony from them. The second part is to go to Boston, which is the seat of Puritan power, and get them to pay homage, bow down, accept the rule of the Stuart government. So he has not just one very tricky mission, but 2. And he first goes to Boston and is basically rebuffed. So then he leaves I mean, you can almost see in this documentation his rage at this, but he basically says, I'll be back. Leaves, comes down the coast, and then, figures he'll deal with the Dutch first and then figure out how to handle the Puritans.
I mean, it's good to never remember that Boston is just always causing problems, even back then. As a native New Yorker, it's good to see that some things never change. So now, all right, we have this face-off. It's basically a game of chicken, right? Who's going to do what first? Who is going to overplay their hand? I think for the most part, I don't think it's a spoiler for about 400 years ago, New York does not get blown to hell, but how close run is that? How easy could it have been that became a whole battle, that people were going to die and that everything was going to get razed?
Yeah, this is the heart of the story. The English in their ships in the harbor and the Dutch on the fort, and they're sending messengers back and forth on boats. And it's this, diplomatic protocol kind of thing. At one point, Nichol sends this, furious letter to Stuyvesant, and the messengers deliver it, and Stuyvesant opens it. And then a while later, the messengers come back, and Stuyvesant says he chose not to read the letter because Nichols forgot to sign it. So Nichols has to go, and then he signs the letter, sends it back. They are both really tough guys. They have both been at war. Stuyvesant famously lost his leg in battle against the Spanish in the Caribbean. And they're both ready to fight. And, from all indications, Stuyvesant several times was he was like, that's it, we're unleashing the guns here. And then he was pulled back from that. And Stuyvesant kept pushing. And Nichols, he was trying to keep his cool. And then at one point, he's like, that's it. And he sends his ships sailing right past the tip of the island, right past the fort, daring Stuyvesant to take the first shot, knowing that means they would, by the rules of warfare at the time, that opens the city to pillage and plunder. And Nichols has put out the word among English farmers on Long Island, who, as I said, have been gathering there. They are amassing on the East River shore, right opposite New Amsterdam. It's a 2-week period, and several times it comes right to the brink and then pulls back.
You mentioned it before. Does a younger Stuyvesant act the way he did? Ultimately, if it was even 10 years earlier, does he come out blasting?
You're very good at what you do, Brendan.
Well, thank you.
That's a really good point. I'll bet he unleashes, and who knows how history would have played out then, because Stuyvesant himself and the Dutch soldiers, there were a lot of soldiers there, and they, signed these affidavits later saying we were ready to fight and we could have taken them, because they're looking at the shore at all those guys, and they see farmers holding pikes and things. They're like, these are soldiers, like we could take them. So maybe they would have, and in which case, I don't know, maybe you and I would be speaking Dutch right now.
Maybe a little bit. How much nationalism is there in the actual population? Because it almost seems like, especially from a history perspective, that, everybody, they were all traders, and they're just like, we don't care who's in charge. Just let the business keep going. We don't care. Was there a huge bit of nationalism in there that, like, we're Dutch and this is what we do? Or for the most part, people were like, I don't care who's governing me. Just leave me alone.
Yeah, that's a very good point about nationalism. It was not the thing that it would later become on either side. And in the case of the Dutch colony in the city of New Amsterdam, it was a very mixed population. And the Dutch, under Stuyvesant, had for years been writing to the West India Company directors saying, essentially, and this goes back to Adrian van der Donk's time, who was the main figure in Island at the Center of the World, so 20 years earlier, when they'd been writing to the West India Company directors saying, in effect, look at this colony we've got, and we've got this interesting dynamic here. We're chugging along, and look at this continent that we're sitting on the edge of, and we can start to exploit it. But we need you to support us. We need soldiers, we need settlers, and the West India Company just didn't listen time and again. So by now, not only Stuyvesant, but the whole population knows that. They know that they're on their own. And from Nichol's side, setting up this dynamic, as I said, starting in London, he had come to learn what this place was, and he very much did not want to have to level it because he was really intrigued by it. He wanted that secret sauce. And the only people who had the recipe were the traders who'd been living there and established their homes and their trading companies. So ultimately, in this back and forth, the two of them are coming to, they both, I think, feel they don't want to destroy the place for different reasons. And they both, funnily enough, want to preserve it. And the big question, I think, in a way, Stuyvesant shows his creativity that hit buried down deep when he comes to accept this idea that the best way to preserve this is to make it English. It's not going to happen under Dutch rule. And, he had loyalty, obviously, to the company that he was an employee of and to the Dutch government. But ultimately, I think he decides his greater loyalty is to the people in this community that he himself had taken the lead role in building.
Do you think it's overstating it to say that this particular situation, it needed to be these two men to come out to this outcome? Because the both of them and the way they looked at the world, but ultimately their flexibility at the same time, that's probably the only way you get to this outcome. Or am I overthinking?
Those what if things are, what if there'd been different people, as you just said, if Stuyvesant had been a younger man and more hot-headed, would have turned out differently. I think in the case of Nichols, in the book, I follow him, but first we follow Robert Holmes, who was a figure very much like Nichols, about the same age, loyal to the Stuart government, and the powers that be in London sent him at about the same time on a mission to West Africa to take Dutch slaving posts. And he was a hothead, and he was raring to go. And he does. He actually goes well beyond orders and just, doesn't bargain with them or anything. He just bombs and takes what he can. And I think they knew the character of Robert Holmes and said, he's right for that mission. And I think they knew the character of Richard Nichols and said, we need him for this one. This one has to be, you have to think on your feet.
And so then it switches, it becomes English, and it just stays that way until the Revolution. Right, Russell? No more changes.
Nice setup. So 1664, if I could just slow you down, what they agree to and what they sign is what is sometimes called the Articles of Surrender. But if it had truly been that, the Dutch would have to surrender their arms and follow these onerous rules and so on. Instead, these articles read like a Bill of Rights. And this is what Stuyvesant and his people were negotiating for. You will keep your homes, you'll keep your families, you'll keep your businesses, your trade networks. Dutch ships can keep coming here because that's what Nichols wants. He wants to take that thing and slowly, make it English. So that then is this merger, as I call it in the book, of English and Dutch elements that gives New York its birth and its uniqueness. That's 1664. In 1673, there's this odd footnote, and I really think it's a footnote, where the Dutch took it back again for a few months. I mentioned before that there were several trade wars between England and the Netherlands in the 17th century. At the start of the Third Anglo-Dutch War, they're bombing away at each other, and these trade wars are they're just trying to grab each other's properties as they're both building their colonial empires of ugliness and slavery. And, we're going to get gold from here and we're going to get slaves from here and all that. It wasn't the Dutch government, but rather one province, the province of Zeeland, that decides, okay, we're going to send out some ships and see if we can do battle with the English somewhere and we can maybe make a few dollars. And these ships sent by one province, go to the Caribbean. They wreak some havoc there, and then they sail north up the coast of North America. They come into New York Harbor, and it's basically, there's nobody home, So they just say, we're taking it. So they took it, and they called it New Orange. They renamed it again, and that lasted a few months, because once the Dutch government got wind of this, they said, you did what? It was like this was not in their plan anymore. They were done with it. So that's why I say it's kind of a footnote.
Now, Russell, there's a lot of people in here, very, very interesting. If I could send you back in time so you could talk to one of them for an hour, I'm taking Stuyvesant and Nichols off the table. That's too easy for you.
Yeah.
If you could sit down with one person from this time period and talk to them, who would it be?
Well, off the top of my head, I might say Dorothy Angola, but we already talked about her because she can give you so much. I mean, she lived the whole life of the colony and beyond into New York. She was had a life in probably in West Africa and then in the Caribbean and then this whole life in New Amsterdam and raising a family, being enslaved, becoming free. What did freedom mean? But, even after you were freed, the condition was we might decide that your children are no longer free. We might take them back. So you have that hanging over your head your whole life and, becomes a landowner and a person of some substance. So I find that to be a really intriguing trajectory.
All right, Russell, there are Poor misguided souls who think history is super boring, and especially this time of history, it is in every single American kid's history book. Now, a lot of people will look at it and say, oh, I already know this story, and history is boring anyway. Now, you and I both know they're wrong, but if I sat one of them in front of you and they said to you, why should I read Taking Manhattan, what would you say?
None of us knows what's happening. I mean, we live in a very tumultuous time right now. None of us knows what's going to happen a year from now or even a month from now. That's how these people felt. The amazing thing about history, when you sink yourself down into a particular place in a particular moment, when there are guns being pointed and all of that, you don't know. You're not someone from the future looking back. You don't know what's going to happen. Your life is on the line, your family, everything. And if you come to history like that, which is what I do when I'm telling stories, I look at it from one person's side and then maybe the person on the other side, it comes alive. And that's what I find exciting about it.
I love it. Russell, the book is fantastic. I loved it. It's the perfect follow-up to what I think is a classic. Thank you so much for coming on and talk about it.
Thank you, Brendan. It's been fun.
And that's it for this episode. Russell, thank you so much for coming on. Taking Manhattan. Trust me, people, it's fantastic. It's awesome history. Go out and grab it. In the meantime, hit us up Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Don't forget the YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.